Good evening, Professor and class. I find myself unexpectedly traveling this evening, so I'm having to depend on the resources and the good graces of the Holiday Inn Express in order to get this project done. With that also, I just want to apologize up front because I have some kind of respiratory thing happening and I'm having this cough and wheeze, periodically on this presentation, but if you'll bear with me, we'll get through this together. So the leader that I found interesting and chose to use for my presentation is the famous Colin. And to the delight of some and the chagrin of others, it is not Colin Kaepernick. It is retired General Colin Powell. And I chose him as my leadership example for a few reasons, but chief among those is the fact that he has had a profound indirect impact on my professional and personal life. So just a few facts. Colin Luther Powell was a United States statesman and a retired four-star general in the United States Army. He was the 65th Secretary of State from 2001 to 2005 under President George W. Bush. He was the first African-American appointed to this post, and he was the first and only African-American to have served on the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Born Colin Luther Powell in 1937 in Harlem, New York, Colin Powell was born the son of Jamaican immigrants Luther and Maud Powell. He was raised in the South Bronx and educated in the New York City public schools, graduating from Morris High School in 1954. Without any definite plans for where he wanted to go in life, it was at City College of New York, where Powell studied geology, that he found his calling in the Reserve Officers Training Corps, or ROTC. He soon became the commander of this unit, and this experience set him on a military career and gave him his structure and direction. I'm going to attempt to transition to the first slide. I apologize for the writing being backwards, but I'm just not smart enough in order to flip this camera around. So what you see here is a young Colin Powell in his ROTC uniform at City College of New York. All right. After graduating in 1958, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army. And while stationed at Fort Devens, Massachusetts, he met Alma Vivian Johnson of Birmingham, Alabama, and they were married in 1962. Now, this same year, he was deployed to the Republic of South Vietnam along with 16,000 advisors by President John F. Kennedy. In 1963, he was wounded by a Puji stick booby trap while patrolling the Vietnamese border. His first tour of duty, he was awarded a Purple Heart and later a Bronze Star. Two awards that are big deals. While in his second Vietnam tour from 1968 to 69, the 31-year-old major was given the assignment of investigating the My Lai massacre, an incident in which over 300 civilians were reportedly killed by U.S. military. His report seemed to refute the allegations of wrongdoing and stated that the relationships between the Americans and the Vietnamese were excellent. Now, later that same tour, he was injured in a helicopter crash, but despite his injuries, he saved all of his comrades. And for that, he was awarded the Soldier's Medal. He later earned an MBA at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and won a White House Fellowship in 1972. So this began his foray, if you will, into politics. He was assigned to the Office of Management and Budget during the Nixon administration and made a lasting impression on Caspar Weinberger and Frank Carlucci. Both men would consult Powell for advice when they became the Secretary of Defense and the National Security Advisor, respectively, in the Reagan administration. Colonel Colin Powell served a tour of duty in Korea in 1973 as a battalion commander, and after that, he obtained a staff job at the Pentagon, where he attended the Naval War College in Washington, D.C. from 1975 to 76. So once he got back into the military, he did a short stint in Korea, fully embraced back by the military, but soon found himself back in the Beltway, in the D.C. area, immersed once again in politics. Well, he was lucky enough to tear himself away from that once more because later he was promoted to Brigadier General and then commanded the 2nd Brigade of the 101st Airborne Division. So this is another thing that he and I have in common because I was also a brigade level leader in that division. So I was the Division Artillery Command Sergeant Major from 2014 to 2016. In the Carter administration, he was an Assistant Deputy Secretary of Defense and Secretary of Energy. And promoted to Major General, he once again assisted Frank Colucci at the Department of Defense during the transition from the Carter to the Reagan administration, and then served as a senior military aide to the Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger, helping to coordinate the invasion of Grenada and the bombing of Libya. So a quick divergence from that, and we're going to go over a few more of his probably lesser noteworthy military positions as a general officer, since at this point he is in fact a two-star general. So going back to the 101st, again, I apologize for the text, but as a Major General, he was the commanding general of the 101st Airborne Division. As a Lieutenant General, he was the 5th Corps Commander in Europe. Also, while a Lieutenant General, he was appointed as a National Security Advisor, but we'll come back to that later on. And as a 4-star general, his first 4-star job, he was the commander of forces, U.S. Army Forces Command, or FORSCOM as we call it for short. So, in 1987, he became the National Security Advisor, a post he held for the duration of the Reagan administration. While there, he coordinated technical and policy advisors during the Reagan summits with the Soviet President Gorbachev, and his conferences to topple the pro-communist Sandinista government in Nicaragua. It was discovered that the administration had arranged for covert illegal shipments of U.S. weapons to Iran in the exchange for the release of hostages. Proceeds from the sale of weapons would go to support the counterinsurgency movement in Nicaragua, which was aimed at toppling the Sandinistas. Now, such support had been prohibited by Congress since 1982. Now, some of us older people, we recognize this as what was called the Iran-Contra scandal, and some of us may remember Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North testifying in front of Congress. Now, General Powell was also asked to testify before Congress about the incident, but was not implicated in any wrongdoing. So in 1989, well, let me back up for a second and just kind of point out something. You know, it was obvious that General Powell was one of those leaders who could transition from a theory Y to a theory X, and he could do it rather quickly. In fact, one of my favorite leadership quotes comes from him, and is an example of this. And it roughly goes, I only have to ask you to do something so many times before I can tell you. And just you can see it went from participative to directive, very quickly. But it gets the point across. And really underlying that statement is, I don't want to be I prefer not to be the directive type of leader, but if I have to be, I'm comfortable with making that shift. So in 1989, President H.W. Bush appointed General Powell as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This post is the highest military position in the Department of Defense, and General Powell was the first African-American officer to receive this distinction. General Powell became a national figure during Desert Shield and Desert Storm operations in Iraq as the chief military strategist. As the chief military strategist, he developed what became known as the Powell Doctrine, an approach to military conflicts that advocates using overwhelming force to maximize success and minimize casualties. So this is also another thing or another event that we have in common, as I was deployed to Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm also. And we'll transition back to the slide once more for a obligatory pick of General Powell and the late General H. Norman Schwarzkopf, and both of whom were the architects of the Desert Storm strategy, a strategy that routed the fifth largest army within 96 hours. At this point, I could see from afar and from historical accounts the transition to a more of a supportive and a participative type of leader. And I believe it's because, as you become responsible for organizations increasing in size, as in essence, as one becomes responsible for an enterprise, so to speak, you have to adopt more of a supportive type of. I think those who are successful adopt more of a supportive type of leadership role, which empowers subordinate leaders to do what they need to do. So General Powell stayed on the Joint Chiefs of Staff for a few months into the Clinton administration, but he publicly disagreed with the president's admitting of gays into the military, although he eventually agreed to the don't ask, don't tell compromise. Excuse me. General Powell retired from the military and from the Army in 1993, and in 1994 he joined Senator Sam Nunn and former President Carter on a last-minute peacekeeping expedition to Haiti. This resulted in the end of military rule and the peaceful return to elected government in that country. In 1995, he published a best-selling autobiography, My American Journal, which chronicles his life and its influence in ins and outs of military bureaucracy and what he had learned in life about personal rules and character. From 1997 to 2000, he was chairman of America's Promise, a nonprofit organization dedicated to fostering character and competence in young people. In 2000, he was brought back into public service by President George W. Bush and appointed Secretary of State. And he was unanimously confirmed by the U.S. Senate. And at that time, it was the highest rank in the civilian government ever held by an African American. During his tenure, Powell became under fire for his role in building the case in 2003 for the invasion of Iraq. So this should be history that most of us should be familiar with if we're old enough to be in college. Initially, Powell had serious misgivings about President Bush's plan to invade Iraq and overthrow Saddam Hussein. He believed that the policy of containment was sufficient to control the Iraqi regime, and he warned President Bush that a military invasion would consume his first term, the president's first term there is, and that if an attack were to occur, it should use overwhelming force, the Powell Doctrine, and have broad international support. And this support would be key to the rebuilding of Iraq. So herein is another point in time where our careers crossed, because I was also part of the force of the initial invasion of Iraq. And I've had personal friends of mine who were on the weapons of mass destruction, task force, if you will. And, they would openly tell me that, they knew from the outset that this was a fool's errand. And there was enough anecdotal evidence to know that, this was just a show being put on for the sake of a show. But let's press on. Despite all of this, President Bush decided to go to war, and in a crucial moment, Colin Powell agreed to support the president. And to advance his case for war with the international community, he appeared before the UN Security Council in February 2003 to present evidence that Iraq had concealed ongoing weapons development program. His reputation for integrity helped convince many in Congress and the country that Iraq posed an imminent threat. For the remainder of President Bush's first term, Colin Powell tried to establish an international coalition to assist in the rebuilding of Iraq. In September 2004, he testified before Congress that the intelligence sources he used in his February presentation to the United Nations were wrong, and it was unlikely that Saddam had any stockpiles of weapons of mass destruction. He advised the committee of the necessity to reform the intelligence community in order to improve gathering and analysis. In 2004, after acknowledging it was unlikely that Iraq possessed stockpiles of weapons of mass destruction, he announced his resignation as Secretary of State. And then National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice was his successor, being the second African American to hold that post. And here we see a post-military and post-public service General Powell. A little bit less stress lines in his face. It's kind of hard to tell because of the light, but the light is necessary. All right. Now, since his retirement, he has remained vocal on political topics, openly criticizing the Bush administration on a number of issues. And in September 2006, he joined moderate Senate Republicans in supporting the rights and better treatment of detainees at Guantanamo Bay. And in 2008, he made headlines again. We announced his endorsement of Barack Obama for president. Coincidentally, an administration that he routinely criticized, and which is a practice that he continues today with the Trump administration. So that's my presentation. I hope it was informative, and I look forward to seeing the presentations of others. Thanks. Good night.